And so ultimately, I think economic diplomacy has become the new issue, the main issue in South Africa's foreign policy. Human rights, promotion of democracy used to be the main issue in South Africa's foreign policy. Last year, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, they have these annual conferences where they invite academics. And I went to this conference, and the opening speech was given by the Deputy Minister, Minister Ibrahim, and he spoke only about, how South Africa can improve business relations with Africa and the rest of the developing world. His entire speech was only about this. He did not once mention human rights, democracy, so what is happening to what is supposed to be the guiding lights of South Africa's foreign policy? One can only wonder. Of course, one of the reasons why especially developing states are moving more towards economic diplomacy is because we're living in a globalized world. There's this notion of competition states. States have to compete with one another for foreign direct investment. This, of course, also means they have to make themselves more attractive to the international community, and this means that increasingly there's also a focus on soft power. How do we make ourselves more attractive for foreign investment? And importantly, I think for South Africa as well, we've seen that there's a tendency to try and link foreign policy more to domestic priorities. In other words, what is it that South Africa needs? What are its problems? Well, poverty alleviation, unemployment, and how do we solve this? Well, through economic development. So that should also be the focus of our foreign policy. Now, for my last part of my paper, I want to just briefly look at participation in South Africa's democracy. And so, I look at, are there actors besides the usual suspects? In other words, the Department of Foreign Affairs and the presidency that are having any impact at all on foreign policy. And of course, I don't want to go into this, but in the back of our minds, we should keep in mind the question, is increased participation in foreign policy desirable? And of course, there's a long tradition in international relations and political science that in fact it's not. Go back to de Tocqueville, go back to Morgenthau, who say that in fact we don't really want the public to have too much say about foreign policy. It's not really an area where they have anything to say. I think our answer to that question, whether we think the public and non-state actors have anything to say or contribute to foreign policy, ultimately, again, comes down to this question of whether state interests are given or are they socially constructed. Because if they are socially constructed, surely the citizens of the state should be able to play some role in constructing those interests, in saying what should be the main foreign policy priorities of a state like South Africa or like Brazil. Now, I think that if we talk about participation in South Africa's foreign policy, it leads us back to the nature of democracy that was created in South Africa in 1994. Now, those of you who might know a bit about our negotiated transition will know that it was an elite-driven process. There was not much input from ordinary people. And this also translated in the nature of the democracy that we have in South Africa today. So even though post-1994, the government had this stated commitment to the democratization of policy, including foreign policy. In fact, one of the early statements on foreign policy was, foreign policy belongs to South Africa's people. And there was great optimism in the early stages that civil society would have more input into South Africa's foreign policy. Early on, 1996, the Department of Foreign Affairs published a foreign policy document in which they asked for input from the public, from academia, from NGOs. But this soon dissipated, and wasn't long before we had what some scholars call a routine-based foreign policy, where really the government was not that interested anymore in hearing from non-state actors about foreign policy. And so I think it has to do with the African National Congress's understanding of democracy, which is quite a paternalistic one. I think they see it rather as government for the people rather than government by the people. Okay, so the people vote and then we decide on their behalf, and that's the only involvement that they should have in government. So briefly looking at actors in South Africa's foreign policy, and I've only picked out a few. You know, one would think that Parliament should play a role in foreign policy, and in fact, according to the Constitution, they are supposed to play an active role in foreign policy. In practice, however, they've not been very active, except for normal duties of, you know, ratifying treaties and appropriating foreign affairs funding. We also have a portfolio committee on foreign affairs in Parliament, which is supposed to play an oversight role. They, again, have really been, you know, useless, to say the least. So what we find is that foreign policy is mainly made in the executive. And there we see a centralization of foreign policy in the President's office. And this started under Thabo Mbeki, who started this process of centralizing policy making, including foreign policy, in his office. So very much almost along the American model, where we see foreign policy increasingly being made in the President's office. Then, of course, we have, as I said, the usual suspects, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. But increasingly, because there's this focus on economic diplomacy, we see the Department of Trade and Industry starting to encroach on their mandate. So there's a lot of tension between these two departments as well. Sorry. Political parties, well, if you talk about political parties in South Africa, it becomes a bit difficult because, as you know, we have a one-party dominant state. So sometimes, you know, even those in government can't make the distinction of whether they are speaking on behalf of government, the state, or if they're speaking on behalf of themselves as members of a political party. To give you an example, in 2008, Jacob Zuma, who is now the president of South Africa, but also the president of the ANC, visited Luanda, the capital of Angola, in his capacity as leader of the ANC, the political party, and promised that once he became president, South Africa would support Angola's efforts to rebuild the country. And of course, this largely has to do with historical party-to-party relations between between the ANC and the MPLA. So, you know, there's a bit of an overlap between what the party is doing in terms of foreign affairs and what the government is doing in terms of foreign affairs. Opposition parties, you know, they criticize, but they really have no impact on foreign policy making. An interesting new development, we see the ANC Youth League, which is supposed to be a part of, you know, the larger political party. They've been starting to take a more independent foreign policy approach, a much more radical, critical approach to foreign policy. I'm going to skip multinational companies. Trade unions in South Africa, interestingly, you know that trade unions are quite strong in South Africa. The government is, well, we are governed by a tripartite alliance, which consists of the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And so the trade unions have also started to take a more independent line on foreign policy. For example, criticizing the government's stance towards Zimbabwe. So this, I think, is a new development that needs more research. In general, however, civil society remains weak in South Africa. We have low levels of participation in foreign policy making. I'm going to skip this because I only have 20 seconds left, I think. So in general, I think, in conclusion, we can say there's domination by the executive branch in foreign policy making. There are some alternative and critical voices, but their influence is limited. And so I think we also need to draw a distinction between participation and impact. I think the government likes to say, oh, we've consulted with academics, we've consulted with NGOs, but when you see the final policy document, you know, those consultations are not reflected. Then economic imperatives, I think, drive foreign policy at the moment, not only in South Africa. And finally, you know, ambiguities will remain. I think in a country like South Africa, which has such a complex history and identity, and again, I think the same can be said for Brazil, I think foreign policy inevitably is going to be ambiguous. Thank you very much.